The world has always feared war. But in October 1962, humanity came closer to destruction than ever before. Not on a battlefield. Not in public. But behind closed doors, inside silent rooms where a few men held the fate of millions in their hands. At the height of the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a dangerous struggle for global dominance. Both nations possessed nuclear weapons powerful enough to destroy entire cities within minutes. Fear had quietly become part of everyday life. School children practiced emergency drills. Families built underground shelters. Across the world, people lived beneath the shadow of atomic war. But while ordinary citizens continued their daily routines, something secret was already unfolding in the Caribbean. High above the clouds, American reconnaissance aircraft flew dangerous surveillance missions over Cuba. Their purpose was simple: observe, photograph, and return unseen. Then came the discovery that changed history. The photographs revealed massive missile launch sites hidden deep inside Cuban territory. Long cylindrical missiles stood surrounded by military vehicles, construction crews, and guarded compounds. These were nuclear missiles. And if activated, they could strike major American cities in only a few minutes. Inside Washington, intelligence officers studied the photographs in complete silence. Every detail was examined carefully, hoping there had been some mistake. But there was no mistake. For the first time in history, Soviet nuclear weapons had been placed dangerously close to the United States. Emergency meetings began immediately inside the White House. Advisors, military leaders, and intelligence officials gathered around maps covered in strategic markings. No reporters were allowed inside. The public knew nothing. Some generals demanded immediate airstrikes against Cuba before the missiles became operational. Others warned that attacking could trigger full nuclear war. Because once one side launched weapons, the other side would respond. And after that, nobody could stop what came next. Military forces across land, sea, and air were quietly placed on high alert. Bombers prepared for launch. Naval fleets moved into position. Nuclear submarines disappeared beneath the Atlantic Ocean. Every hour increased the pressure. Every decision carried unimaginable consequences. President John F. Kennedy now faced one of the most terrifying choices in human history. As military activity intensified, the atmosphere inside command centers became almost unbearable. Phones rang constantly. Radios transmitted coded messages. Maps were updated every few minutes. Time itself had become the enemy. President Kennedy rejected immediate airstrikes, for now. Instead, he announced a naval blockade around Cuba, warning that Soviet military shipments would not be allowed to pass. The world heard the announcement on television and radio. For many people, it was the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Across American cities, fear spread rapidly. Supermarkets emptied. Families rushed to buy supplies. Some prepared underground shelters, uncertain if they would survive the coming days. Meanwhile, Soviet ships continued moving toward Cuba. If those ships crossed the blockade line, American naval forces might open fire. One mistake at sea could ignite global nuclear war. Beneath the ocean surface, Soviet submarines carrying nuclear torpedoes moved silently through dark waters. Many crews had lost communication with Moscow and did not know how close the world stood to destruction. Inside the White House, arguments became more aggressive. Military commanders warned Kennedy that waiting too long would only strengthen Soviet missile positions. Others urged patience, fearing catastrophic retaliation. No option felt safe anymore. Surveillance flights over Cuba continued despite extreme danger. Pilots flew directly above missile sites knowing enemy forces could shoot them down at any moment. And then it happened. An American reconnaissance aircraft was struck by Soviet missiles over Cuba. The pilot was killed instantly. Inside the war room, panic spread rapidly. Some officials demanded immediate retaliation against Cuba and the Soviet Union. The world now stood one step away from nuclear war. For several terrifying hours, leaders on both sides struggled to prevent total disaster, while military forces prepared for the possibility that peace might already be over. The destruction of the American aircraft changed everything. Military commanders believed the Soviet Union had crossed a line that could not be ignored. Pressure mounted on President Kennedy to authorize direct attacks against Cuba. Bombers armed with nuclear weapons waited on runways. Missile crews stood ready underground. Submarines patrolled silently beneath dark oceans, carrying enough firepower to destroy entire nations. The world had entered the most dangerous moment in modern history. Inside Soviet submarines, conditions became unbearable. Crews endured extreme heat, exhaustion, and fear beneath the ocean surface. One submarine captain believed war might have already begun. Without communication from Moscow, he considered launching a nuclear torpedo against American forces. For a few terrifying moments, human civilization stood on the edge of annihilation because of confusion, fear, and silence deep underwater. Only the refusal of one Soviet officer prevented the launch. That single decision may have saved millions of lives. Meanwhile, military radar systems across multiple countries operated at maximum alert. Every unknown signal created fear. Every movement raised suspicion. A misunderstanding could trigger irreversible destruction. Inside government buildings, exhausted officials debated through the night. Some demanded immediate action before Soviet missiles became fully operational. Others warned that nuclear war would destroy both sides completely. Nobody truly knew how this crisis would end. President Kennedy understood that every decision carried terrible risks. If he attacked, the Soviet Union might retaliate against American allies in Europe. If he waited, nuclear missiles in Cuba might become active. The pressure became almost impossible to bear. For 13 days, the future of humanity depended on a handful of exhausted men trying to avoid the unthinkable. Then, unexpectedly, a message arrived from Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. Unlike the aggressive public statements, this private message sounded emotional, personal, and deeply concerned about the possibility of nuclear war. Khrushchev warned that if conflict continued, both nations could face unimaginable destruction. For the first time during the crisis, there was a small sign of hope. But the situation became even more confusing the next day when a second Soviet message arrived. This one sounded colder, harsher, and more demanding. Inside the White House, officials debated intensely over which message represented the true Soviet position. Was Moscow divided internally? Was this a negotiation tactic? Or was time simply running out? Behind closed doors, secret diplomatic negotiations quietly began. Publicly, both governments continued appearing strong. Privately, they searched desperately for compromise. Kennedy's advisors remained divided. Some believed the Soviet Union was weakening. Others feared the crisis was spiraling out of control. Military forces remained on full alert, while diplomats exchanged messages in secrecy. The world outside remained largely unaware that history was being shaped through hidden conversations and fragile trust. Every sentence mattered. Every delay increased danger. Yet slowly, both sides began searching for a path away from disaster. Not because they trusted each other, but because they feared what would happen if they failed. Finally, after days of fear and uncertainty, a secret agreement began to form. The Soviet Union would remove its nuclear missiles from Cuba. In return, the United States publicly promised not to invade Cuba. But privately, another secret concession was also made. American missiles stationed in Turkey would eventually be removed as well. Most of the public never learned about this hidden part of the agreement for many years. Slowly, tension began to decrease. Soviet ships turned away from the blockade line. Construction at missile sites stopped. Military forces on both sides reduced their readiness levels. Inside war rooms across the world, exhaustion replaced panic. The crisis that nearly destroyed humanity was finally ending. No nuclear missiles were launched. No cities were erased. No global war began. But those involved understood something terrifying. Human civilization had survived partly because of luck. A misunderstanding, a delayed message, or one emotional decision could have changed history forever. The world had come closer to destruction than most people would ever realize. And for the leaders who experienced those 13 days, the memory never disappeared. When the crisis officially ended, millions of people across the world felt relief. But behind government walls, many officials remained deeply shaken by how close humanity had come to nuclear annihilation. Secret reports were archived. Conversations remained classified. Details were hidden from the public for decades. Only later did historians fully understand how fragile the situation had truly been. One submarine commander. One misunderstood radar signal. One impatient military order. Any of these moments could have triggered global catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis became one of the greatest warnings in human history. It proved that even the most powerful nations on Earth could lose control faster than anyone imagined. After the crisis, direct communication systems were established between Washington and Moscow to reduce the risk of future misunderstandings. But the fear never disappeared completely. Even today, nuclear weapons remain active across the world. Governments still compete for power. Military tensions still exist. And somewhere behind closed doors, leaders continue making decisions capable of changing the future of humanity. History does not repeat itself exactly, but it often returns in different forms. And the question that haunted the world in 1962 still remains today. How close are we now to the next global crisis?